Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depends on when you're watching this. I'm Jeremiah Dukes, and I will be presenting Chapter 10, which is Conflict Management and Negotiations. Uh, on the first slide, it says there, as long as there's humans, there will always be conflict. This has been true in my life. I'm pretty sure it's also been true in your life. If you turn to the next slide, you can get a breakdown of what we will be discussing. Uh, we will look at the nature of conflict. We'll look at the interpersonal conflict and management strategies on how to deal with that conflict. We'll look at the conflict process, also the negotiation process, and then we'll end with the conclusion and a question that I have asked that you take a look at and try to answer to the best of your ability. Uh, as we look at conflict, we need to ask ourselves the nature of conflict. What is it? Conflict is a disagreement that arises from two or more parties perceived as a threat to their interests, needs, or concern. Uh, Conflict is bound to happen as long as we work and deal with people. Our response to those conflicts, it will be either classified in two ways, and the way that we respond really shows how we are perceiving conflict. We can do it in a positive way to where we can be in a conflict, we can receive what the person is trying to talk to us about, and we can take it and we can grow from it. We can be, this kind of conflict is called a constructive conflict. It is when someone is adaptive. There's positive conflict approach, and it seeks to maximize gains for both sides, and it leads to several different alternatives. Then there is also the destructive type, which is also called the dysfunctional conflict. This leads to focus on emotion. What's different between the two parties? They sometimes they get so riled up that they forget the issue of the conflict, and they focus more on about getting even or trying to, retaliate. An example of this is if I get bad remarks on my 360 evaluation where I work from, I can either positively look at it and say, okay, these are areas that I need to grow in, and these are the ways that I can improve and to make sure that I get a higher remarks next time, or I can respond negatively and dysfunctionally to where I can take it in and I can blame shift. I can say the reason they don't like me is because I'm tall, or the reason they don't like me is because I'm loud, just whatever it is. They don't like my personality. And so it normally goes down and it causes more separation, isolation. And when this happens, it alleviates to not only a bad 360 this time, but and hopefully, or it could progress to a bad 360 next time. You may want to know, like, what are the different sources or common sources for conflict? Some common sources for conflict would break down to if you differ in what the task goal is, like what is the goal? How can we get there? That would be the process, the different process goals. You're asking yourself, what are the different processes? How can I get to that different process? Uh, you also have interpersonal differences, differences of motivation. Why are people doing this? Different personalities, different aspirations. We also have resource constraints. Every organization or every place only has a certain amount of resources. That includes you. You have a certain amount of resources when it comes to how much energy you want to spend on something. And so that can also cause a conflict. You also have changed. That's the thing about organizations in life. There's always change. There's always transitions. And so how do you approach with that, with rebranding, downsizing, different values? Like maybe their worldview and your worldview is not the same. And so that causes conflict. Poor communication, which I know none of you, myself included, is is bad at. Yeah, and then task interdependence. Like, how can I depend on somebody, and how if they're responsible for getting this work to me at a certain point in time, like I have to wait or have to wait around for them to do it, and maybe they even have to wait around for me to get it done. Those are things that really can affect and can be a source of conflict. Then you have structural conflict. This is talking about stuff that's horizontal and also vertical. Horizontal are those colleagues, the people who are on your team that you're working with. And then the horizontal are the people who are above you, or the vertical people who are above you, or even your subordinates who are below you. These are sources of conflict that can really shape how we do things. If we approach a conflict and the conflict tends to continue to get heated, next slide, it moves into a state called conflict escalation. Conflict escalation is when one party involved in a conflict uses an aggressive tactic or begins using more aggressive tactics than the other party. So if you're going to go here, I'm going to take it up there. So this is escalating. This is moving forward. There's a thing that Frederick Glass has 9 stage models of conflict escalation on page 380 in our textbook, and it has diagrammed of the flow. And I'm not going to go into it, but it's something to look at. And it talks about the different stages of how conflicts escalate. And one thing that it talks about as it continues to escalate, the more it escalates, the harder it is to reverse. And that's so important to know, is that, hey, if there's a possibility for me to bring it down earlier, I probably should. Which we're going to move into de-escalation. Like, what does it mean, and how do I go about to de-escalate? Yeah, it's hard to do that, especially when your emotions are all tied into it, but it takes some intentionality. Here it talks about some do's and some don'ts. Some do's to it is to be empathetic, listen, put yourself in the other person's shoes. Also, use time as a resource, like sometimes delay and allow some time to separate so that things can be cooled down. Also, control your body language. Cast a win-win situation for the conflict to be resolved. Do not be hostile in your language or use hostile body language. Raise your voice, which is really hard for me. I have a high voice already, so I need to lower my voice. Don't ever minimize the situation that the person's going through or make them lose face in front of someone, and focus on the emotion. Don't ever focus on the emotion. Focus on what needs to happen. Emotions can be the subjective qualifier that pushes conflicts to either a constructive or a destructive type of framework. And so these are the ways to look at, like, how can I de-escalate? How can I cause things not to escalate so much? Next slide. Next, we're going to talk about some management strategies. And these management strategies, I tell you, they differ in their concerns for other people. I like them all. I think one of my favorite is collaborating. Collaborating reflects high concerns for both you and the other person. This is about problem solving, pursuing a win-win situation. You collaborate with somebody, you put things together. As we work on group projects here at Liberty, we have to collaborate a lot with individuals. Then there's the compromise. Each side sacrifices a little, but it also gains a little. And so there's a give and a take, and so we compromise. This reflects a moderate concerns for other. It's okay for a temporary solution, but maybe we both want to get on a win-win situation. So each player wins and loses something. Then there's the competing. The competing thing is like high concerns for your own. You really don't care about what the other person's thinking. And sometimes this is not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're trying to set a precedent about something, or is it something that's central to the core? This is your value. And so you're gonna, I talk about when I tell to people about like faith, there are certain things that I say are shotgun theology, things that I won't allow, like, people to talk about, like the virgin birth. That's shotgun theology. I will take a bullet to believe in the virgin birth. I won't probably take one about like if the body and bread of Christ is literally the body and bread of Christ. Probably won't take a bullet about that. The next one would be compromise. Oh no, the next one would be competing. This right here is like you have high concerns about your own. We talked about that. You get into setting ultimatums and threats, and that's where that really comes in that one. Then there is accommodating. This is low concern about your interests and high concerns for the other's interests. And this sometimes is that if your boss is right and you don't want to get into an argument, or if you know it's really important to somebody and you really don't want to, get into a altercation with them, to go ahead. This is primarily used on issues that are not so important to you, but really important to the other party. Then there's the avoid. This is passive conflict management style, low interest to you and the other person concerned. And this is just for trivial things like where are you going to eat at? Like, I'm not really concerned about that, not going to fight over that. And so we have to really look at that. The conflict process, which is the next thing, next slide. It highlights, 5 skills that every manager needs when they are trying to deal with the conflict resolution and management. They need to listen attentively. They need to make eye contact. They need to rephrase. They need to summarize. They need to question, to ask for more clarification on an issue. They need to communicate both verbally and non-verbally, and think about this as mediation. I'm trying to talk with you so we can get to a win-win situation from both parties. A person's ability to successfully resolve conflict is linked to their ability to be an effective leader. There's also, we need to recognize that when talking to people who are from different cultures, that there are different ways that you need to think about how conflict is looked upon. We're going to move into the negotiation process. Next slide. Negotiation process deals with several things, but the process itself is when 2 or more parties make offers, counter offers in succession in order to reach an agreement. Destructive negotiation occurs when zero-sum conditions where any gain from one party is offset by an equivalent loss to another party. So if I take my business here, this party over here is not going to get my business. And so therefore, you can see how negotiations like that, there really is a winner or there really is a loser. The next one is the integrative negotiations, which is a win-win negotiation in which the agreement involves no losses for either party. We both win. That's a beautiful thing when that happens. I don't think it happens enough, but it's good when it does happen. There are 4 fundamental principles to integrative negotiations, and I'm going to go through those really quick. You need to separate the people from the problem. There's the problem. That's what we're working with, not the person who you're talking or dealing with. Focus on the interest and not on the position. Also, invent options for mutual gain. There is a lot of different options, and that's what a constructive way of looking at things is. It's like, what are the different options? There are many ways to skin a cat. Think about how you may be able to do that. Insist on objective fairness criteria. Make sure that the criteria that you set is good for both sides. Next will be when you're doing negotiations, know that in intercultural negotiations, we need to pay attention to issues beyond the actual negotiations. Uh, if you get to a point to where you can't really negotiate, there are other alternatives, and that's what we're going to talk about next slide. Next slide, we're going to talk about the different alternatives to uh, if negotiations break down. That's first one would be conciliation. A third party builds a positive relationship between the parties, improves their communication, and facilitates their decision. This may be able to be. This may a constellation. They may be able to issue a binding, which means that people have to actually go by it opinion. Mediation is a impartial third party who facilitates or mediates a discussion using persuasion and logic to suggest alternatives. This right here, this is just suggesting different solutions from parties they may or may not accept it. Arbitration is a third party involved, usually who have authority to impose a settlement on someone. So these people actually have power. They are attributors, and they're actually going to listen to both sides and say this is what's going to happen. And ombudsman, they are people who come together and they investigate some complaints about something and then mediate a fair settlement between the parties. Each of these are solutions that can happen between different parties in your work, and that leads us to the conclusion. I have a couple questions, a couple of things that I wanted to point out. Constructive and destructive conflict are all about the party's response to conflict and not the conflict itself. So how do you respond to a conflict, not the conflict itself? The further conflict escalates, the harder it is to reverse. Take note of that. If there is escalation, the farther it goes into escalating, the harder it is to reverse it. If you control emotions, you can control the perception of the conflict. My question for you, based on the common sources of conflict, which of them do you interact the most in your current position? And how do you bring the conflict to resolution? I went a little bit over. I hope you're not upset, and I hope that you can answer the question. I look forward to your responses. Thank you, and have a great day. Bye-bye now.